Are the wheels of justice beginning to move on cases emanating from the state capture inquiry at last? Just this week, former MEC for Agriculture in the Free State, Mosebenzi Zwane, appeared in the Bloemfontein Magistrates Court on charges of corruption. But Bain and Company's role in the state capture has highlighted the role of the private sector in capturing the state. The company has now been banned by Treasury from doing business with government entities for the next 10 years. In light of this, economists have now called for companies who enabled state capture to pay reparations. Joining me in a panel discussion on whether the private sector will also be pursued are Dr. Iraj Abedian, who's an economist, Esethu Mancotywa from the Black Management Forum, the Deputy President, Derek Thomas, CEO at Letsema Consulting. A very good afternoon to all the guests who have joined us in studio, and also Dr. Abedian, who joins us via the Zoom. Now, welcome. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having us.
In dealing with corruption and state capture cases, the NPA has previously been heavily criticized for not going after the big fish, so to speak, and failing to take decisive and visible action against high-level corruption. But some strides have been made. The NPA unveiling a plan in March, making some ambitious commitments. I suppose the question to ask, starting with Dr. Abedian, are the wheels of justice finally beginning to move?
Thank you very much for the invitation. I think the answer broadly is yes, albeit for my liking and for the nation's liking, I would like to believe way too slowly. And that we know why, because part of the state capture strategy was to pretty much debilitate and mute and hollow out NPA itself. So we have a bit of a catch-22 situation. We have to have a strong NPA for the wheels to move much faster. But at least a beginning is made, and we hope that it will not grind to a halt with the intervention of the politicians.
Do you believe that it inspires some sense of hope, especially looking at the impact on business?
Thank you, Mpho, for having the Black Management Forum. I think for us, when we were reflecting on this topic, we went back to a statement that we issued on the 18th of January when the first installment of the state capture report came out, where we called for, amongst other things, the banning of any company, whether local or international, that had been found to have aided and abetted state capture. And at the time, because it was the first installment of the report that had really focused on SAA and I think it was ESCOM. Those were the two parts of the first state capture report. And Bain was SAA and SARS. Yeah. And Bain was heavily implicated in that. And we called on Bain to be banned from doing business with the state. And we did face a bit of backlash, and this was, remember, the 18th of Jan. So it was quite a radical statement to make at the time. And I remember BLSA and ourselves going back and forth about this, and eventually Bain themselves actually walked away from BLSA under the pressure. And so I think the BMF has been quite consistent, right, from the first installment of the state capture report to now, about what should happen to the private companies who were co-conspirators in the state capture report. And I think we take exception to the international companies. We don't condone the local ones, but the international ones who will come into a country such as ours that they wouldn't do in the UK and the US, and they come into our country and they basically plunder our state resources, and I think as the BMF we looked at this deeper and said, when a company such as Bain conspires with your Tom Moyane, with your Jacob Zuma to capture an entity such as SARS, you actually are then incapacitating SARS to collect on tax revenues. And further than that, if you look just further, you say, what are tax revenues really used for? They're used to feed our children, they're used to school our children, they're used for our health sector, they're used to deliver services to South Africans. And so this becomes almost as serious as a crime against humanity. And so we didn't take this lightly at all. And I think as the BMF, I just would really like to reiterate that as the subsequent versions of the report came out, we didn't really want to issue more statements because everything was really captured in that first statement that we issued. And I think as we go on, I'll elaborate on some of the other measures that we called for right on the 18th of January when the first installment of the state capture report was released.
Absolutely. In fact, I want us to expand more on the impact of the economy here at home as you look at the input and the repercussions for big business coming on our shores. Now, we know that a lot has been said about the pace. What is your take when it comes to the wheels of justice?
So these, I think Iraj mentioned that part of state capture was in fact hollowing out our institutions. So that's a matter of record now. What we don't want to do is have an accelerated process and then end up with an ineffective prosecution. I'd much rather we take our time, or the authorities take their time and execute on their mandates properly. I think the jeopardy of going to court with an ill-prepared brief and an ill-prepared prosecution will do more damage to justice in our country than taking their time.
Absolutely. Going back to Dr. Abedian, we've already seen the likes of former MEC for Agriculture in the Free State, Mosebenzi Zwane, appearing in court on charges of corruption in connection with the 200 million rand Estina dairy farm funds, which then speaks to the so-called big fish, the NPA making some strides there. But Dr. Abedian, you, for instance, have long made calls proposing that not only government officials but companies involved in enabling state capture should be held accountable. We've seen some moves. The NPA, I think in March, also making mention of their big accelerated plan, and also going after the multinational management consulting firm McKinsey and Company South Africa.
Yeah, I think there is too much talk and too little action. And part of it is we mustn't put all the burden on the NPA. This is not just a problem or a disease that will be cured by NPA. NPA has a critical central role to play, but the rest of the society, especially the private sector, has a very important complementary role. For example, it really baffles me as to why, after all this damage that McKinsey has done, still McKinsey has got an office in Johannesburg and behaving as if nothing has happened. And some businesses, big corporates, South African and continental, still use them as if they are reliable, honest, ethical businesses. It equally baffles me that the very executives of McKinsey who were implicated, and they were enablers of corruption at a larger scale, looting and doing cancerous corrupt behavior within our institutions, especially state-owned enterprises, are still in London doing the business as if they've done nothing wrong. So there is something here that the business must come to the party. We cannot have, for example, Sasol still using Bain as if Bain is a usable, ethical operations. And you cannot say, well, NPA will take care of it. No, we got to take an ethical stand. And this is where business leadership South Africa and big corporates, in my view, they come short by miles. And it's unfortunate.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like for us to hold the thought there as we continue with the conversation on the role of the private sector in state capture. We will continue the conversation shortly after this. Don't go away. All right, welcome back. Thanks for staying with us. We continue our conversation with Dr. Iraj Abedian, who's an economist, Esethu Mancotywa, who from the Black Management Forum, the Deputy President, as well as Derek Thomas, CEO at Letsema Consultants, speaking about the role of the private sector in state capture. Now, before the break, we were speaking to Dr. Abedian, who was talking about the role of other players, that we can't leave it all to the NPA. I mean, that's a criminal matter that needs to be charged, but there's also social aspects that need to also be considered here. The office in Johannesburg behaving like nothing has happened when it comes to McKinsey and Company South Africa. I suppose big business also has a voice to add in adding to the pressure.
400%. I think one of the things that we've reflected on as the Black Management Forum is the fact that admission or being a part of your big business organizations like your Business Leadership South Africa and BUSA is voluntary. And therefore we feel that those organizations then, because it's voluntary, lose sort of an ability to hold institutions accountable. And we would actually call on those organizations to look at how to hold their members accountable. I mean, I will not to belabor the point, but with BLSA, with Bain had to be the one walking away. For some strange reason, BLSA couldn't find it within them to say, Bain, we simply don't want you to be a part of Business Leadership SA anymore. Similarly, with what Dr. Iraj Abedian was saying, why would a company such as Sasol or any private company in this country still be using, whether it be McKinsey or Bain, as consultants? What does that say about their sort of solidarity with the rest of the country around the state capture project? I think big business really has a huge role to play, and for me and for us as the BMF, I think they've really failed to play it. Another part that has really been disturbing for us is where we found that whistleblowers are struggling to find jobs in corporate South Africa. That, for me personally, as the Deputy President of the BMF, and for the BMF as a whole, just gives me chills. Because what does it say? I read the book of Musila Mutepu. I can speak about Ethel Williams. I can speak about Babita Diokoran. May her soul rest in peace. I can speak about Dr. Masimba Dawa, who was practically in tears at the State Capture Commission, saying how that he's losing his house, his car, his job. He can't take his children to school. You can speak about Themba Maseko, who's also written a book. You can speak about Cynthia Stimple.
People have gone into exile.
Why is it that corporate South Africa will not hire whistleblowers? If they stand by the principles of ethical, effective moral leadership, and if these whistleblowers are seen to have done almost a country and national duty, why? I mean, they should be celebrated, but instead not one corporate in South Africa will hire them. And for me, that is a huge indictment on corporate South Africa.
Why are there loopholes when it comes to solidarity? And, we're moving towards accountability, but there seems to be no backing.
Yeah, it's quite frankly, it's surprising. Big business are the clients of professional services providers. They can, en masse and in solidarity with the country and as a grouping, say, we are not going to tolerate this. This is very easy to achieve a pariah status for these firms that have done so much damage to our country. Remember, these companies not only operate in our country, they continue to hire young professionals, young black professionals. They still represent a weirdly aspirational source of employment in the country. 100%. They are perched in positions of privilege when it comes to access to confidential information. They are perched in a position of privilege when it comes to access to C-suites and boards. Why are we not dealing with their behavior in an appropriate fashion? And the only conclusion I can come to is that I think it's about our imagination and our sense of pride and dignity as a nation. Mm-hmm. That somehow we are so damaged that we can't find it in ourselves to tell these perpetrators to move on.
Yeah.
So it says a lot about us, quite frankly.
Absolutely. And perhaps going back to Dr. Abedian, we know that Transnet has underwent massive looting of state funds at the peak of the state capture era. The remnants of the looting are still evident today. I mean, if you look at locomotives, you look at the operational and financial difficulties, it's all very evident. Perhaps let me get the question from you, Mr. Thomas. How would you define the implications of the Bain and McKinsey saga for the public sector and the procurement processes?
Well, I mean, the SOCs are organs of state. They represent our aspirations for taking us to a better place. They are custodians of fixed investment in the country. They are big employers in their own right. They make the wheels of commerce and industry turn. Eskom, Transnet, in a different category, SARS, of course. We don't have anything without these institutions. Yes. Our fundamental commerce relies on on these SOC. So to damage them, to give them advice that isn't of the highest level of ethics and propriety, does damage to not only those entities, the country in general, but the clients that rely on those SOC. So it's an overarching amount of damage that the country and its institutions suffer as a consequence.
Yeah. And Dr. Abedian, we cannot ignore the impact on South Africa's economy. Looking at the kind of status quo at the moment, the unemployment rate and all the expenses that South Africans are drowning under, how intricate is the process of reparation from perhaps a political, economic point of view?
Look, it's not complex. It's not as if it's impossible to do. It requires, as you hinted at it requires political commitment and political strength, as well as a team of technical people, economists, statisticians, lawyers, to sit down and look at the damage and just put it in a context, Paul and colleagues on the panel. We mustn't look in, I suggest, in vacuum, as if we don't know what the damage is. Back in 2012, South Africa was well above investment-grade jurisdiction, in a fiscal surplus, in a very, very comfortable space. Yes, there were global conditions against all the countries, not just South Africa. But today, we are way below investment grade, commonly known as a junk status. Our fiscal situation is in a crisis. Our SOEs are really a shadow of what they used to be. And the implications are massive. Not just we live in continuous load shedding, sort of affectionately known, which means our hospitals don't have power, our schools don't have, our homes don't have, and people literally suffer and die. And we mustn't forget that. When power goes. At the same time, our ports are not operating, our rails is in a mess, our hospitals are not, they haven't got funds. So that's the reality of a state capture. And all the firms that have been part of it, yes, politicians have been, and NPAs on their case, as you mentioned, but politicians could have done what the firms enabled. Politicians could have stolen $1 million here, $500,000 there, or $500 million there, never hundreds and hundreds of billions of rand. You needed the KPMGs of this world and the PwCs of this world and McKinsey's and the Bains and the banks and the law firms to orchestrate that, to enable the like of Guptas and a whole lot of other looters to bring us to this debilitating state that we are. As a result, let's just be very practical. As we speak, the reality of Transnet is that South Africa's fresh berries that are produced by farms and farm workers are rotting at the ports. Simple, very simple, billions of them. Last year, as a result of Transnet's inability to serve clients, the citrus industry alone lost 1.8 billion rand. That means farm workers, farm investors, and our farmers are 1.8 billion rand poorer. And that is the reality of it. I don't want to go on and on, but that we mustn't speak in vacuum what it means to the economy. It has debilitated us. Our government is now really a shadow of what it was 10 years ago because of these corporate plunders that they have done. And we can't just say, well, it's because difficult, it's complicated, it's politically complicated, we must just pretend as if nothing has happened.
Yeah.
Quite the contrary. Because it's complicated, because it has such a deep and wide impact on our society, we have to go and get reparation.
And perhaps bringing the conversation back in studio, how then do we begin to recover? I mean, the big losses in business, I suppose COVID-19 exacerbated the situation. Where is that glimmer of hope in the so-called, if I may call it, the aftermath of the height of state capture, although that in itself may still not really be part of the, the bigger conversation. But in moving forward and those windows of opportunity for business, small business, to also thrive in such an economy.
Paul, thanks for asking that. You know, as the BMF, we always look back to who are our members, what is our mandate, really. And therefore, everything that we sort of do and say speaks back to yes, the broader South African society, but to our members. And I refer back to our statement of the 18th of January, where we recommended that there be an appointment of an oversight committee to really strengthen the process of appointing both boards and maybe really critical CEOs of critical SOEs. And we called on that in January, and we were happy to see that in the fourth installment of the report, Justice Zondo mentioned something very similar. He may not have used the same words verbatim. So that's the one thing that we think as the BMF would go a very long way in saying, what have we learned and how can we change this trajectory? Because the boards and the senior management, the executive of these SOEs and even in these private companies are the ones who actually set the tone. And so we called for that in January. We are very happy and support that the Commission has called for it a couple of months later. So that's the one thing. The second thing is really the BMF is saying to its members that we want to support managers and executives, because what you find in a corporate environment is that there's a unionized group of employees. And as soon as you get to middle, senior management and executive level, you're not unionized. You're not allowed to be unionized. And people have come to us and said, when we call out incidences of corruption, of malfeasance, we are silenced, we are charged, we are ostracized, we are worked out of the companies. And I think as the BMF, we're saying to those people, we want them to be able to come to us and to tell us and to explain to us so that we can call out companies, especially private companies, who do these kinds of things. And I think private and public. And I think, Paul, really, we do want to focus today on private companies, but I'd like to echo the sentiments of my fellow panelists when I say, with the public companies, the reason why you can never really move away from them is because they really form these fundamental pillars that hold up this economy. If you look at Operation Vulindlela, which the President has taken into the presidency, it speaks about your network industries, it speaks about rail, it speaks about ports, it speaks about roads, it speaks about water, it speaks about electricity. And we never want to minimize the role of the private sector, but when Eskom doesn't work, it plunges the economy into darkness. And that's why, whilst we will continue to vociferously call out the private sector as co-conspirators in this project, but we can never take our eye off the public sector, because that's where the services to the South African people actually lie. And so I just wanted to really just touch on what both my panelists had said about the public sector and why we always seem to go back there without ever condoning or letting the private sector off the hook. So I think as the BMF, those are really the two things that we would like to elevate out of the State Capture Commission, the appointment of this committee that will assist us in deploying King Force it used to speak of ethical leadership. It now speaks of ethical and effective leadership. And that panel would be able to deploy that ethical and effective leadership not only into the private sector, but also into the public sector.
Effective being the operative word, I suppose. We will continue to have this discussion with my guests on the panel shortly after this. Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us as we continue our discussion looking at the role of business and the private sector when it comes to the state capture and its ripple effect on the country. I'm still joined by Dr. Iraj Abedian, economist, Esethu Mancotywa from the Black Management Forum, Deputy President, and Derek Thomas, CEO at Letsema Consulting. Thank you so much for staying with us. As we continue, perhaps rounding off the conversation, Mr. Thomas, what do you think when it comes to solutions on a global and a local view to stop consultancies in carrying out corruption?
Well, I find the work of people like Athol Williams particularly interesting. He's just been beating this drum incessantly and with with a great amount of competence, quite frankly, telling his narrative and being honest about it, and then using connective tissue into British parliamentary circles, and perhaps as far afield as the US. And what's interesting is I think there should be a global negative view of corruption, especially as it relates to poor and unequal countries as our own. Fiscal resources, rands, are sacred. And we should be telling other countries that when their private firms come into our country, that they should behave themselves, quite frankly. We cannot afford anything but the most elegant forms of behavior and ethics when it comes to professional services, precisely because of the privileged positions they occupy. Now, what is interesting is how you can have a contagion effect, so that bad press in a small country like ours, which quite frankly can't be that large in the profit and loss statements, the income statements of these global firms, how that can have ripple effects in their core markets. And that's a useful place to play. And that means you must have strong advocacy. And you must have strong state-to-state relationships.
In the global versus local view, what are your thoughts?
Thanks, Paul. So, Mr. Thomas, I wanted to take a little bit of perspective issue with something you said earlier about how you wouldn't want the NPA to take a weak case, and I'm paraphrasing, to risk taking a case to court which it will then lose. And I think for me, the fact that you saw, for example, Bell Pottinger being sanctioned by the UK Association for PR Firms for sowing racial divisions in our country. And then you saw...
Okay, I think we have a technical glitch with your mic, but perhaps as hold the thought, we will continue. And going to Dr. Abedian, what are your thoughts around that view, the global versus local view, in efforts to stop consultancies in carrying out corruption?
But first of all, it's not just the consulting firms. The consulting firms in South Africa are doing it and elsewhere. And the solution, given the integrated global financial economic system that we have, is ultimately the establishment of a global, if you like, international corruption court that brings together, as part of a global treaties, these corrupt practitioners and enablers, be they the like of Mackenzie's and Bain's or the like of Glencore that just paid the penalty because of what they're doing in DRC. So we mustn't just, in a way, take our eyes off that some of these mining companies, some of these industrial companies, they are equally complicit and active in the conduct and ethical conduct and the promotion of corruption. So, and many of these countries, such as ours, do not have the legal muscle and the resources to do justice to the corruption that is happening worldwide under illicit financial flows more broadly. So I think ultimately we need an international court of corruption, but with the very understanding that when amounts are recovered, it goes back to where it was stolen. We can't have a situation where, for example, SAP, the German software company, was fined $70 million because of its corrupt behavior in South Africa, but all that amount went to the U.S. Treasury, not to South Africa, where the crime was committed. You can't have Glencore doing corruption in DRC on the continent, but the money, £100 million, goes to UK Treasury. There is something absolutely double whammy of a corruption or unethical behavior. So those are my views.
Yeah, but how would these amounts then be calculated in terms of a breakdown of ratios as to where they then end up?
Look, if there is, let's say, a penalty to be done, and there's really three elements: the amounts that are stolen or abused through corruption, the cost implication of that, which is a different thing, the opportunity cost of that, and there is reparation, and the fourth element of it, some kind of ethical charter that such companies, be they consulting companies or corporates, must sign that in the event of any such behavior, their licenses will be cancelled, and the directors involved will be named, shamed, and globally banned.
Mm-hmm. So, just rounding up our conversation here, you were speaking about how it's the accelerating the process would come with some caution.
I think what I was really trying to say, Paul, was I think as South Africans we need to take a bolder stance, and I think perhaps we need to not see the NPA as the only mechanism of calling companies to account. What I was alluding to, and I'm not sure if this was before or after my mic stopped working, was Bell Pottinger was sanctioned by the UK Association for PR Firms in the UK. Yes. So it didn't have to be the law enforcement agencies as such of the UK. And they were sanctioned for sowing racial divisions that hadn't been seen since the times of apartheid in South Africa. And Dr. Abedian is saying so. He's saying whatever reparations they had to pay went to the UK government. Similarly, way before we sanctioned Bain was sanctioned in the UK from doing any business with the UK government. So I'm a little bit... why is it that we are so extraordinarily careful and waiting for the NPA and a trial that may take a number of years? Why aren't we using our other mechanisms to make these companies actually feel the financial pinch, if that's the only mechanism that we have, regardless of how small we may be on their balance sheet? So I think that's the first thing that I really wanted to allude to. The second thing I wanted to allude to, and I know we're drawing to a close, was, and I think Justice Zondo said this, and we fully agree with it, because some BMF members are what we call professional entrepreneurs. So we are an association of managers, but over the years we've seen that some of these managers then become entrepreneurs. And what we also would not like to see as a result of the state capture project is the demonization of public procurement as a tool for transformation, as a tool for economic transformation. What we would not like to see is as I say, the demonization of public procurement, because it's one of the tools through which government can assist our SMMEs, our entrepreneurs. But we need ethical and effective leadership in state-owned enterprises, so that when that public procurement is actually filtered into the economy, that it's not in a corrupt manner. So that's just something that I think as the BMF we did want to mention, that we know that public procurement is very important. I mean, government is always said to be the biggest buyer of goods and services. Yeah. All we are calling for is that this be done in an ethical and effective manner, and that all the checks and balances that the Zondo Commission has suggested be put in place. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, because this is really quite an effective tool to stimulate the economy and to really distribute that massive public procurement spend to a sector of the economy that really needs it.
Mr. Thomas, corruption, just rounding up, that has really been the big problem, hasn't it? That bad press that has garnered around the various transactions when it comes to big and small business in South Africa.
Yeah, I think we have a particular form of corruption in South Africa that's particularly debilitating towards economic growth. It's bizarre that you can have milder forms of corruption cohabiting with economic growth. Historically, that's been the case in other countries. We just seem to have a special form of it, and quite frankly, I'd like to see us operating without any of it, quite frankly, because we are, again, a poor and unequal country. Our resources are limited, and our people deserve the promise of our constitutional promises that were made 25, 30 years ago.
Thank you so much. We're going to have to leave it there, thanking all my guests, Dr. Abedian, who is an economist, as well as looking at Deputy President of the BMF, Esethu Mancotywa, as well as Derek Thomas, the CEO of Letsema Consulting, speaking about the role of the private sector in state capture.